Welcome back. Joining us as we put the day's markets action into perspective is Jacobus Brink from the Schmidt Family Office. Jacobus, thanks so much for your time today. Now, there's been a lot of caution in markets as investors await the Fed minutes and inflation data out of the US, as well as that ECB rates decision. Ahead of these data points, we've seen numbers point to a strong US economy, a resilient labor market over there in the US economy, further pointing that those rates are going to stay higher for longer, right?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on the show. Yeah, no, indeed. I think we've come quite a long way from November, December last year, where the market was pretty much pricing in, I think, 6 rate cuts at one stage. You now in the US probably looking at about 2 rate cuts. It's even sort of up in the air if June's going to be the first rate cut. No, so indeed, and we're seeing a similar thing across Europe. Some strong data coming out over the past number of days as well. But I think consensus at this stage, it does seem like the ECB has been firmer on that they are looking to start to cut in June. But once again, I think the economic data coming out of the US has just been so strong, especially some of the labor market figures we saw. So I'm pretty convinced that the Fed will probably still cut once or twice this year, but we might see it being pushed out a little bit. I think one thing that did come out today that not a lot of people focus on, but we tend to put a little bit of weight on it, is the NFIB Small Business Optimism Index, and that came out quite a bit lower. So despite some of the very strong data points we have seen, it does seem like the sort of the what they used to call the engine room of the US economy might be weakening a little bit. So yeah, it's going to be a very interesting one. But I think markets today, just in general, everyone's sort of taking risk off a little bit ahead of tomorrow's CPI print out of the US and the PPI later in the week, as well as the ECB meeting.
And it'll be interesting to see whether inflation has remained sticky, because the past few months, those prints we've been getting are quite scary, Jacobus. Now, monetary policy aside, investors have also been eyeing geopolitical issues. We've had a ceasefire talks in the Middle East slow that oil price rally. In the meantime, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has wrapped up her week-long China trip. What have you made of the news flow that has come out from there? And how far did the trip move the ball when it comes to US-China relations, especially ahead of the election in the US?
Yeah, I think it was quite an interesting one, because what not a lot of the media houses have actually reported on was the fact that Russia's foreign minister also arrived in Beijing on the exact same day as Secretary Yellen, and he actually met with President Xi himself, so there is a little bit of a power play, I think, going on there. But, I think as far as, is this a political move? Yes, I think it is to some extent. I think the Democrats will probably gain a little bit of traction from the more sort of Republican side, right-leaning component, with them actually pushing back a little bit on China with regards to things like flooding the market with as they call it, cheap Chinese exports, etc. And they were also very sort of hard on the Chinese with regards to their relationship with Russia. So I think to a large extent it was a bit of a political play from the Democrats, but yeah, it didn't really, there was nothing really surprising that came out, in my opinion. But it does seem like Janet Yellen did put out a very strong message in a post-visit press conference.
Let's get into the currency moves that we've been seeing. That local unit really has been strengthening against most of its global currency pairs. At some point, I think it was sitting under 1850 to the dollar today. What's behind the strength? Are we just seeing a softer dollar?
Yeah, the yields have obviously been pulling back most of the day, and coming off quite a number of weak highs. So, I think that the dollar is a bit softer. I think the big thing driving the rand possibly is the gold move higher. As there's obviously a lot going on in the geopolitical space. It does seem, you mentioned the oil price, coming off a little bit after some positive things coming out with regards to ceasefire negotiations. But but those are still very much up in the air. I think from that extent, you'd expect the rand to possibly sell off a little bit, but I think it's mostly driven by gold in general that's pushing it down. But it's been trading in this range for the last 3 months, and we're currently sort of at the lower end of the range, around 1850. So I think it's going to take quite a bit to push through that, and the next sort of key level we're watching will definitely be around 18. But yeah, an interesting move in the rand nonetheless.
Definitely, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, especially with our own elections acting as another risk factor on that front. Let's move over to some company news now. WeBuyCars has raised nearly 1 million rand ahead of its listing this week, and they valued those shares at around 18.75 rand. What has your sentiment been about this planned listing? I mean, it's always welcome to have a listing on the JSE, especially in this kind of environment.
Yeah, and I think so. It's an interesting one. I think where it's priced now, it's valuing the company with a market cap at about 7.8 billion rand. It's a little less cheeky than what transaction capital floated a few months ago. But I think it's a great story. It's a company that was started more than 20 years ago. They currently have about 10 to 15% local market share. They sell 13.5 million thousand vehicles a month, so it is definitely a success story. I think it'll be interesting when it goes on to trade on the 11th of April, because I do think there are going to be transactional capital holders that doesn't necessarily want to hold WeBuyCars, and on the flip side might also be true. Someone that would rather own the WeBuyCars instead of having just this rump within transaction capital. So we expect a flurry of activity on that side when the listing goes live on the 11th of April.
Yeah, very interesting to see. Jacobus, before I let you go, let's get your stock pick.
So my stock pick for today is an interesting one. It is Rocket Pharmaceuticals. Rocket Pharmaceuticals is a company that focus on developing gene therapies for rare diseases. The sort of macro biotech space has been something we've been looking at over the past number of months. It obviously had a terrible 2022, and the only thing that really sort of saved it from having a third consecutive negative year, the tech center, the biotech space in general, was the rally, on the Fed pivot towards the end of last year. Rocket Pharmaceuticals is an interesting one. They're sitting on a lot of cash, and there seems to be some chatter around possible M&A activity, and there's also the potential of FDA approval for their second round gene therapies on the horizon. So I think it could be an exciting one.
Rocket Pharmaceuticals, one to look out for. Jacobus, thanks so much for your time and just taking us through the day's markets action. That was Jacobus Brink from Schmidt Family Office.